imagine the swan as a brain, so the thinking brain. So can swan, think, right? For us, this is radical presupposition because it also helps us to decenter the human. Right? So something that has been in the center of maybe Western philosophical thought, it is important sort of like mission maybe or a vision of the swan school to allow alternatives. Right? So to imagine where there could be those alternatives. Could those alternatives be in the swan? This is an open question. So Chiara Bottici is a professor at the New School in New York, philosophy department, and she's Italian. So and she's been traveling now from Brazil via Iceland. It's been a long journey, so I don't want to take more time for this introduction. I want to really welcome Chiara, and I want you to join me in welcoming Chiara.
Thank you so much. I have to say that for a philosopher of the imagination with Italian origins, this is really the best possible invitation to come back to the country for an imagination in this form. So as you can see, I'm not showing images. This is not because I'm bringing here the philosophical prejudice that images are not important. It's actually the opposite. So I often use images when I present, but I thought in this context, given the way in which it's constructed, my intervention would be perhaps even more fruitful if it begins with a suspension. So let's suspend images, let's suspend our capacity to imagine and the capacity that images themselves have to imagine for us, and try to think together about this question of who imagines, how things are imagined, and how we can best conceptualize and think about them. So in doing this, I will be mainly speaking about three concepts: imagination, the imaginary, and the imaginal, which is a relatively new term. Perhaps I don't know whether it's being used in Italian very often. I will say more about it in a moment. But the reason for this is that I think all the three different concepts bring with them different sort of presuppositions, and any discussion of the capacity to imagine should begin with a clarification of what is at stake whenever we pick up and choose one of them. So I would like to begin with a quotation from Richard Rorty, quote, "Interestingly, philosophy is rarely an examination of the pros and cons of a thesis. Usually it is, implicitly or explicitly, a contest between an entrenched vocabulary, which has become a nuisance, and a half-formed new vocabulary, which vaguely promises great things." End quote. So, drawing inspiration from this passage, I would like to explore here the context that has generated around the language of imagination, in particular with these three areas: imagination, the imaginary, and the imaginal. And in particular, I would like to explore the possibility that the more entrenched vocabulary, in particular the vocabulary of the imagination, has become indeed a kind of nuisance in trying to understand the capacity to imagine. And I would like to explore what Rorty would call a half-formed new vocabulary that promises many things. And this is the vocabulary what I would call the imaginal. So after having elucidated a little bit the concept of the imaginal, I will move on to show its force, and in particular the role that it plays in our social life, concentrating on the transformation that have been brought about by what some people call the post-Fordist transformation of capitalism in our time. So first step, from the nuisance of imagination to the promises of the imaginal. To begin with, I would like to pose a question and invite all of us to think about what we say when we use the concept of imagination, and it's very colloquial form, and what we say when we say things such as, oh, this is the fruit of your imagination, or things such as, it was recently its anniversary, all the power to the imagination, and Paris 68, the slogan. We are more or less implicitly assuming that imagination is this faculty to represent what is not there. Whether it's hallucination, like we say, oh, this is the fruit of your imagination, it means it's not there. Or when we say all the power to the imagination, because we want to evoke the capacity of thinking, whether it's a political system or something that is not yet there. So when we use the concept of imagination, we tend to assume, whether we want it or not, that it's linked to the idea of something which is either unreal or, in any case, not yet there, and therefore entertain a sort of problematic relationship with the present. Now, is this a useful way for thinking about our capacity to imagine? I tend to think that, and this is the beginning really of my project, in a time where the virtual has become the most real, if we keep thinking of imagination by bringing with it all the kind of ontological presuppositions that are imbued in the history of the concept, we may really end up in reproducing a kind of vocabulary which has become more of a nuisance than a tool for advancing. And I say this in particular because as a philosopher and historian of philosophy, I do think that the language that we use brings with it presuppositions that are historically grounded. And the interesting about doing a history of philosophy, which all those who are trained in the Italian system, all those of you who have been exposed to that, know, is that you are forced to go back to the genealogy of the concept that we use. And if you look at the concept of imagination, what actually comes out of it, it's some very interesting discoveries. So first of all, this association between imagination and unreality, or imagination and not present, it's a relatively new thing. There are, if we go back, let's say, to the stepsister of imagination, which is the term fantasy, and the Greek term for the concept of fantasy, what Aristotle used when he said something that really set up the concept of imagination for Western philosophical tradition for a very long time, when he said, whenever we think along with an image, thereby implicitly saying that whenever we think, we're also imagining somehow. When he said so, he used this word phantasma. Now, if I say phantom in English, or phantasma in Italian, or any other associated language, we think that it's something unreal. Now, when Aristotle used that term in ancient Greek, he didn't mean that. There's actually passages from the Cello, his work on the comets, where in order to prove how things appear to the senses, he uses the word fantasia in order to mean this is the true thing. You may think otherwise, but if you look at what the empirical reality tells us, therefore the phantasmata themselves, you will see that things are really in this way. So the question here is, we can talk about this in the discussion if you're interested. There are very precise historical reasons why the concept of imagination, how we use it, and even in Latin, the term imaginatio, is not linked with the idea of the unreality of its content. It's only during modern times that this idea that imagination is the faculty to represent what is not there becomes systematically associated with the concept. So, since it's something that was not imbued in the concept from the very beginning, but it's something that became imbued with the concept only with modern times, so in terms of human species not a long time ago, we may well ask ourselves, it arrive at some point, this implication, is it meant to remain there, or can we think about our capacity to imagine by disentangling it from this sort of presupposition? So this is the first important point which I think we need to discuss when we talk about imagination, and something again which is rooted in the very genealogy of the concept. And the second point which I would like to point to is the way in which the concept of imagination, particularly as it emerges in modern Western philosophy, is intrinsically imbued with what has been called the philosophy of the subject. That is, the idea that imagination is a faculty that individuals possess. So when you say, this conference is the fruit of Gediminas imagination, I mean that there is an individual body, like clearly...
And
Christopus. Okay, three individuals. And. But let's say, if I say one person, okay, or if I say three persons, or five, I'm talking about individuals, okay? When we tend to think that imagination is an individual faculty, and what this means is that it's something, whether we explicitly recognize it or not, we tend to think as something that we carry with ourselves. So we have our reason, the capacity to reason, and then we have the capacity for imagination. We tend to think of it as something that is the prerogative of an individual body, which literally means something that cannot be divided. Okay, I cannot divide Christopus or Nomeda, who I don't see here, but that's the sort of philosophical presupposition which, in terms of ontology, is being criticized as a form of philosophy of the subject. And the idea is that in this room there are many individuals, a certain number of people who are like billiard balls that go around and interact with each other, exchange their imaginations, but the starting point are individuals. Okay. Now, in order to criticize these concepts, it has become in the last, I would say, 50 years, customary to say individuals are actually not really those free agents who go around with their imagination, they take it out of their pocket and use it, but they're rather shaped by the social, psychological, natural environment they live in. Okay? So individuals are not those who carry the imagination, but rather that those who are shaped by the imagination themselves. So there has been a change in theory from theories of the imagination to what is called theories of the imaginary. Now, what is the imaginary? The imaginary is this context. Let's say if imagination is a faculty that we as humans possess, the imaginary is this context that possesses us. So to speak. Now, when we say, okay, finally we solved the problems, we have left the presupposition of Western philosophical tradition on a side, we move from imagination to the imaginary, let's just talk about the imaginary. Now, the problem is that most of the time when we speak about the imaginary as a context, we tend to conceive of it as a kind of container, so a kind of macro individual that contains different individuals within themselves. And so in this sense, people can speak about the Italian imaginary or the Japanese imaginary, as if these were in themselves kind of macro individuals interacting with one another. Again, there seems to be a kind of conceptual tension between the two, and currently most of the theories and attempt to conceptualize our capacity to imagine are caught between the two extremes. Like either you are theorists of the imagination or you are theorists of the imaginary, and people don't even tend to speak to each other. They organize separate conferences, you pick your field. But there has also been an attempt to really go beyond this separation and try to set up a more fruitful discussion. I think it has already been mentioned, the work of what I think is one of the greatest theories of the imagination and the imaginary, was Cornelius Castoriadis. Cornelius Castoriadis was a philosopher of Greek origins, but he was also a psychoanalyst. He lived most of his life in France. And the most important contribution of his philosophy is precisely to have pushed away from this idea of imagination as an individual faculty towards what he called the imaginary institution of society. And so the idea is that it's not individuals themselves. This idea that we are this fully formed thing which cannot be divided into itself is not what creates imagination, but is rather a product of imagination itself. The idea that we have an ego and then we can choose whether we're going to use our faculty of imagination or our faculty of reason, it would say is just a fantasy which only makes sense within a certain imaginary that we can call the Western modern philosophical imaginary, but which would not make sense. For instance, if we take somebody else like Frantz Fanon, he would say that's just a delightful fantasy that some European white men have most of the time. We are not that free agent, free individual carrying with us all the faculties that we can choose how to use or not to use. So Castoriadis points to the fact that individuals are always instituted by the imaginary signification in which they live in, but also at the same time they are instituting them. So he points to this dialectic in a very fruitful way. But I do think that his theory, as well as other important theories that have been an attempt to go beyond this dichotomy, he still remains entrapped between the opposition. I'm not going to go too much into the details of it, as it's seen by the fact that he can't decide between the two. At times he speaks about the radical imagination, other times he speaks about the social imaginary, and when he tries to formulate the ontological assumptions behind this, he makes recourse to what I think is actually a reductive understanding of the monadic isolation of the unconscious by saying, yes, society creates us, but there's a nucleus of the unconscious which is really monadic and you can't completely shape it. I think that's not correct, psychoanalytically speaking, but let's say we can leave that on a side and discuss it later if you want, but most of all, where it leaves us is still with this opposition. So if we begin with imagination, whether a philosopher or not, we tend to think that it's an individual faculty to represent what is not there. And if we begin with the notion of the imaginary, we tend to think of it as a context that, on the contrary, shapes the imagination of the individual. Now, is that the whole story? No. In the last 15 years, particularly thanks to an important book by Cinzia Fleury called Imagination, Imaginaire, Imaginal, so a French philosopher, there is this term, what I call the Imaginal, which has become a third, perhaps vaguely promising concept, but which helps, in my view, to solve a lot of the tensions that even in Castoriadis were left undecided. Okay, so first of all, what do we mean by imaginal? But imaginal is a term that originally derives from Arab philosophy, in particular from the Sufi tradition. It's useful, first of all, because it goes beyond the idea of the individual as we tend to conceive of it. I actually tried to develop it in connection with what I call the ontology, an ontology of the trans-individual. So what is an ontology of the trans-individual? Is the idea that this alternative between individual and societies, right, between imagination and imaginary, is actually a false alternative. That in both cases, we are thinking about the individual as something that cannot be separated. But every individual is, on the contrary, of the form of individuality, is always a form of a trans-individuality, whereby trans-individuality, I mean that we are not objects given once for all, right? But we are always processes, and in particular, we are always processes constituted by processes that happens at the inter-individual, so between two individuals, supra-individual, so beyond the individual, and infra-individual. Okay, are you following? So, trans-individual, we assume these three levels. Inter-individual, let's say, neither of the people speaking in this room has decided to be born. We were all the result of the encounter between two individuals. Most cases, at least a sperm and an ovum. Okay, that's an example of the inter-individuality I have in mind. Supra-individual. None of us, including this table, has decided to be born in a certain place, in a certain time, within certain prerogatives. Okay, so that's something that completely escapes even the mutual encounter between two individuals, but it's simply there. The environment that shapes us, the corner of the globe we're born into, the time we're born into, the language we speak, which is constantly shaping us, and which is really super individual. We don't control it. We can do little intervention. I'm hoping that after this lecture, you're literally not going to be the same person, and you're all going to speak about the imaginal for the rest of your life, but maybe that's not going to happen. But anyway, if that happens, it's an example of the way in which I would say the individual and the supra-individual constantly interact with one another. But most importantly, there is the infra-individual level. I think this morning Jennifer really beautifully showed the way in which the plants we live by and we live in and that live in our body constantly shape our individuality. Okay, the air we breathe in. We can think about the air we breathe in as micro individuals that enter our body and then exit our body. Think about the fluids that transverse our body. Think about the bacteria that constantly inhabits our body. We tend to think that we are these individual atom, but actually most of the time we are not. We are barely in control of what happens in our different organs. So all of this to say that if we start to adopt this ontology of the trans-individual, then we can also start to go beyond the false alternative between do we imagine individually or do we think and do we imagine it socially? The two, most of the time, are conceived as alternative, but they're actually not really alternative. They're like two sides of the same dichotomy. On the contrary, if we take the perspective of the imaginal, we take the perspective of images, right? Representations which are also presences in themselves. One of the advantages of the concept of the imaginal is that if I say this is purely, at least in English language it works pretty well, if I say this is purely imaginary, you tend to assume that it doesn't exist. Same thing in Italian, if I say questa idea è puramente immaginaria, this means it's not there, implicitly, it's part of the language. But if I say this is a very imaginal being, if you read the definition of the imaginal in the Oxford English Dictionary, it simply says it's made of images. Same if I say in Italian, I'm not that often in Italy, but if I say è un essere immaginale, you don't immediately assume that it doesn't exist. Okay? So the advantage of the concept of the imaginal, I think, is twofold. Is that it brings us outside of the humanistic framework and the Western philosophical assumption, but also it suspends the question of the status of reality of images. Do they exist? Do they not exist? Do they represent something that is there or not there? All those kind of questions are suspended by this concept of the image. Okay, are you following? Now, I don't want. This, I think, is the gist of what I want to propose that we think about. But the second step is to, because one may think, okay, fine. If this is true, and if there is this perspective, we don't begin with the individual, we don't begin with society, we begin with images themselves. First of all, there will be no individual nor societies without those images. One may say, why did we have to wait until Chiara Bottici came here and gave this lecture to hear this term imaginal, if that was so important, so promising? Okay, so why are we talking about this now? You can say, not me. Why is this book on the imaginal being written now? Why is this concept taking so much predominance right now? So the short answer, I believe the long one for the discussion, if you're interested, is that there has been indeed an increase in the production of images. There has been an increase in not just the number of images that mediate our life, but also a quantitative change that is so exponential that, to speak Hegelian language, the quantity has turned into a new quality. The concept of the imaginal signals this new quality. At least this is the way in which I read this new philosophical trend. I don't need to remind here of, for instance, the exponential number of images that enter our screens, multiple screens every day, has changed the nature of social life. It has changed the nature of politics. And think here in terms of history, like just, a century ago, people almost didn't have any visual contact with their rulers, right? That's why you have all this beautiful public art and you had propaganda because you needed some sort of visual contact. I mean, now we are inundated by images of our rulers, perhaps even too much. But together with this is also more, again, it's a quantity that at some point spill over into a new quality. Our imagination is really so much swamped into this excess of images that not only a competition is generated between images of which image is going to prevail, and therefore you have a tendency towards the spectacularization of social life, but also there's something about the production of images themselves and the stylization technique that have changed the nature of image production and therefore really changed the nature of this imaginal world we all live in, immersed. An easy way to argue this, for those of you who are familiar with Walter Benjamin philosophy of the fate of images in the time of technical reproducibility. Now, he has been pointing to the fact that one of the transformation of the reproducibility of images is the fact that they tend to lose their aura. And he says they tend to lose their connection with the Hink Nook. Now, he was writing in the 30s and he was thinking about photography. Now, at the time, you still needed a moment of the original shot. What happens with the pixelization technique is that that question that it could still raise, it no longer makes sense. Like when you have a digital image, you don't have an object. You always are faced with a process. So images have become more and more processes of perpetual maintenance, which somehow also goes nicely with the idea that they are as strong as individual as we are. It's very often hard to know who has created an image. We're exposed to even the very question of the authenticity of the image is lost. When we raise the question of is this image authentic or not, we are kind of holding to an ontology which is to a large extent superseded. Now, and I'm moving towards some conclusion. Why is this the case? And how can we handle this increasing move towards a spectacularization of our social life? So I'm drawing here from jointly from Guy Debord's idea of a society of the spectacle and the theories of post-Fordist capitalism, among them the Italian operaism, because I think there's a nice convergence between the two. So I'm drawing in particular from Debord, I think strikingly insight and reversal of Marx's Capital. So if Marx could begin Capital by saying that the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities, Debord opens this societal spectacle by observing that in societies where modern conditions of production prevail, all of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation. End quote. Now, I think that what Debord is pointing to is the fact that the spectacle is not simply a form of entertainment, is not simply something that is part of the fact that images have become a commodities, but the spectacle has become, like capital, a social relation itself, something that mediates our social relation. And in this sense, I think it goes together with the inside of theories of post-Fordist and cognitive capitalism, who have been arguing that our capacity of imagining, our creativity, is no longer simply something that we consume when we consume commodities, but is something that is constantly enlisted in the production process itself. We all have to be artists. We all have to produce constantly new ideas, new images, new CVs, entrepreneur of ourselves, be able to sell the product of your imagination even before it's being sold, what is called the just in time. Now, can we still imagine something new within this scenario if imagining something new is always not just a possibility but an economic imperative? Writing in the 60s, Debord was able to identify, I think, a crucial change in the nature of contemporary capitalism. And it is commenting on the premonition of Debord that Berardi has, for instance, recently written, quote, "The Situationist movement dissolved when Paris started featuring the graffiti Power to the Imagination. 1968 was realizing the dream of historical vanguards, Dadaism and Surrealism, the dream of the abolition of art and the routine of daily life, and above all, the fusion of the two, the dream of a life where difference prevailed on repetition. But, as we later found out, imagination became crystallized in the image, and the predominance of the image paralyzed the imagination. machines of homologating production of the image have infiltrated the collective mind and wired up by introducing psychic, linguistic, and relational automatism. We must recognize this. Real society is no longer capable of imagining anything that has not been produced in the laboratories of the global homologated system. In his most celebrated work, the board called this homologating effect of imagination the spectacle. The spectacle is what must be seen but can never be lived. End quote. So I think Berardi here really captures attention and really captures something that happens after the 60s when people criticize capitalism with the slogan, all the power to the imagination, and capitalism replied by saying, okay, let's try it out. All the power to the imagination. Let's all be creative. Let's all participate in management. Let's all become entrepreneur of ourselves and see what happens. Now, there is a way in which, I'm pretty sure this is part of people's everyday life, but it's also part of a more systematic series of reflections on the nature of contemporary capitalism, and in particular the passage from a mode of production mainly aimed at producing commodities and objects to a mode of production aimed at producing state of effects, aimed at producing services. There's a limit to the cars that you can possess, but there's no limit to the services you will need in your life because there's no limit to the desire that you may have. Okay, so I'm really here running out of time. Does it mean the game is over? No more possibilities to imagine anything new. Again, by drawing inspiration from the board, but also from a philosopher whom I've been loving and using a lot in my work, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote about a very powerful critique of the spectacles at a time, the beginning of modern times, mainly thinking about the Parisian society coming from rural Swiss Alps. He perceived it as a kind of societal spectacle, which we can say has only been magnified by contemporary capitalism. He wrote this striking sentence by saying that the spectacle is what brings us together with the illusion we're going to do something together, but actually isolate us. But at the same time, which is very close to what the board says when he says that the spectacle has become something that connects people as separated, as atomized individuals. But he also concludes his work on Narcissus. He wrote a beautiful play called on Narcissus. And in the preface of Narcissus, he says, whenever there's a poisonous plant, there's also very often the remedy in the plant itself. And this is a kind of, and he does this, he criticizes the spectacle and he writes a play while doing this, so it's a kind of contradiction. And in order to defend himself from the accusation of doing spectacles while criticizing spectacles, he says, quote, a man who has ruined his temperament by an injudicious use of medicines is forced to continue to rely on doctors in order to stay alive. End quote. So maybe this is our condition too, like that man who has been intoxicated by the spectacle of contemporary capitalism, and perhaps we're very sick. I think we are sick, but perhaps we also have a possibility to escape from this sickness, and is trying to cure that very sickness by trying to enact a different and hopefully less alienating spectacle. Thank you.
I will ask you 3 questions, you could choose and not answer the other. First of all, I was, okay, that's completely accept your play about, imagination, the imaginary and the imaginal. But in this sense, for me, was wondering why you use always the same concept, individual. Because that's philosophy and tradition try to use a little bit different, individual or just individual, because individual just translation of atom. And this is very strange dialectics when you are talking about imaginary of that's collective imaginary or groups imaginary or result in the imaginal. But on the ground, the subject of this imaginary, you presuppose individual, but not individual or co-individual. And for example, for me, trans-individual, not clear concept. Trans-individual, I could understand, but trans-individual, it's not clear for me, I couldn't understand. The other, it's about dialectics. You promised that, okay, maybe I wrong, that when you quoted Hegel, not quoted, commented actually, Hegel, this transposition from quantity to quality, and you remarked that you would like to present the imaginal as some kind of new quality, but I don't understand what do you mean by the new quality in this sense. Maybe I lost the tension. And the last, when you commented with Guy Debord, I very like this international situationist. And I fully accept your critique and how do you present the Deborian Marx interplay. That's nice. But that you remember that international situationist as well, Guy Debord, wrote as also some positive ideas how to resist this societal perspective. They presuppose at least two concepts. One of them detunement, which could be translated as hijacking, creative hijacking, and the other is about the which means planeur or just which was presented by flux movement, fluxus movement, the creative flux, that's some kind of new, in the searching of new strategies, how to resist this accumulation, or global even accumulation of these spectacles. So this is my comments actually, rather than the question. But if you could choose an answer, I will be very happy.
Yes, no, these are very important questions, and I think I tried to answer all of them with clarity. So first of all, the idea of the trans-individual is because I did think about using alternative terms, and others have been doing it. I mean, philosophers, they constantly invent new terms, then nobody really cares about it. Which is, it works so much. My last book was like 10 years of work, and then nobody even cares about the word you're using, which is disappointing. But besides that, there's the fact that I think we can, precisely because I really think in the Borgian terms, you can operate at change, but you're more likely to be effective if you operate at change with the material that you find outside there. Now, if I go to the bar outside and I can say, can you give me a individual? They're not going to even understand what I mean, okay? But if we start thinking in terms of, the concept of individual is outside there. We live in the West, at least here, and I live in the West, in between Europe and the US. And the concept of individual is so entrenched. You can't get outside of it by saying, please read Deleuze and Simon Bell, and you'll find out why you should not think in those terms. So I find it more useful the notion of the trans-individual, which, by the way, I take it from Balibar reading of Spinoza. I was cheating here. I was giving the short version of the ontology of the trans-individual, but if some of you is into ontology enough to read Spinoza, I'd be happy to give more details. What I think is useful there in this idea of the trans-individual is that it takes fully burden of the language in use and try to determine it. Do you want to talk about individual? Let's talk about the trans individual. And think, for instance, how things start to change when you look at this in terms of gender, for instance. We tend to think that trans people are the exception. If you take the idea of the trans individuals seriously, they're not the exception. I mean, we are all trans individual. Freud would say at the beginning we're all at least bisexual or perverse polymorphous, and then people they're forced to become either a woman or a man and behave as if they were one or the other, but actually we're all trans, in this sense, transgender. So, that's an example of the way in which changing the vocabulary from individual to trans individual could make sure you're being understood by the people you talk to outside of a philosophy circle, and at the same time pushing a different ontology forward. So the other point, I'm taking too much time. Okay, so the other point, which is the I'm not an Hegelian masculinist. It was just because the idea, I do think there's a moment when the quantity, just the number of images, spills into a new quality. And that's what I mainly wanted to say. I'm not really committed to Hegel in the philosophical sense of the term. I'm committed to the idea that just the sheer number of images we have to deal with in our daily life is changing something in the very nature of images themselves, and the very phenomenology of images, the very way we experience them. And finally, yes, the how to resist, the paper has a whole section on the détournement, and how this idea of the homeopathic remedy that I take from Rousseau is actually, I would say, the détournement is after Rousseau, and they both read Rousseau, so the homeopathic critique of the spectacle comes before the détournement, but it's the same principle. You take what is there, what is making you sick, and then you determine it. You try to use it in a change direction, using a different way. I did like the Rousseau approach, because Rousseau was a great botanist, and he really loved plants and believed in plants, and he thought that plants could teach us something. He thought that plants were able to think, and he thought his remark on the passage I've read is from the play of Narcissus, where he has to defend himself from the accusation of criticizing spectacles while writing a play. Actually, it's an opera even, and he responds by saying, in every plant that is poisonous, there's also the remedy. So he responds by thinking with plants, which I thought was a nice hint towards the idea that it's not just us humans who have the capacity to imagine and to think.
I have two questions. You already partially answered to a part of what I was asking, but you started by mentioning that Imaginal breaks the dichotomy, breaks the binary division between what is the social imaginary, individual imagination, and then you say that he described exactly what also you were mentioning. So this shift from quantity to quality. So my question is, do you see the Imaginal mostly as a descriptive device or as a disruptive category? You partially answered, but I would like you to go deeper into this topic. For example, did you also, when you were speaking about Imaginal, immediately I related the concept of multitudes or multitude, to go back to Spinoza or Machiavelli on how the concept of multitude was shaped by Navy and other contemporary thinkers. So actually my question would be, where is the, if there is some disruptive potential in this imaginary concept, which of course is already very useful, even if it's only descriptive, it's useful. The other thing came to when you were mentioning BIFO, and I think here there is one shift which is important, because the critique of imagination in BIFO starts when he reflects about what he calls, in my opinion, in a too much negative way, too pessimistic way, when he kind of critiques the defeat of the long Italian 68. So after the defeat of 1977 movements in Italy, he says the future is over. So imagination is very, very much linked in its critique to the impossibility of imagining something very specific, which is the future, which is not to imagine any image, but to imagine the future. And also working with some artists recently, I've been coming back a lot to this issue of the possibility of imagining a future. From my perspective, what I see is that this possibility of imagining a future, which means imagining an alternative to the status quo, is sort of caught into a double trap. So from one side, you have what Mark Fisher also described as capitalist realism. So we imagine, neoliberalism had the effect of allowing every sort of imagination, but something that is not neoliberal. So, in fact, every position, every concept, every content, we are allowed to imagine everything. The only thing that we are not allowed to imagine is a future, post-neoliberal future. And so this is one side of critique, so this is the neoliberal break to imagine the future. And at the same time, it's quite paradoxical that when you talk about artists that imagine a future now with operaist thinkers, activists, they say, no, they immediately misunderstand this capacity with futurism. So with the idea of delaying the struggle into a future. Why? And I'm stopping here because I'm taking too much time. Well, I think now, and I'm not a fan of artists. This should be clear. I think that artists alone cannot change society, cannot have a transformative effect. You have to create agencement, they have to deterritorialize, like activists have to deterritorialize in order to use some subversive potential imaginary, or imaginal, I don't know. But I think that now we're in an interesting moment, because there are artists that are, again, exercising and imagining alternative futures as a tool to change the present, not as a futuristic tool to delay action.
Well, my God, these are so important questions. I wish I had an answer for all of them. But I do have the beginning, some thoughts. Okay, so I use the Imaginal. I don't see my role as a philosopher as that of telling people what they should do. So here is disruptive concepts. All the power to the Imaginal. Okay, so that's not the way in which I think of philosophy. I think of philosophy as maybe I'm a Hegelian there, piece of confession, as a process of thinking about our present in its most, in its abstract form. So the concept that we use, and I do think that. Going back to the quantity becoming a new quality, I do think that the fact that this concept of imaginal, has been retrieved from Muslim Sufi philosophy now. Why are we reading Sobahardi, who speaks about these, angels in the Islamic tradition and recovering this concept? Because I think there's something in the concept itself which describes a position, a predicament in which we throw ourselves immersed. Now, this position is very much what Berardi is talking about, except the fact that when we tend to think about, we cannot imagine the future, the problem is that capitalism has found the best possible way to imagine the future. We are all in debt. right? Whenever you use a credit card, you are imagining your future, you are shaping your future. Capitalism is this fantastic utopian system because it's constantly based on being an economic system predicated on the accumulation of capital. You're constantly projecting yourself, you're constantly imagining the future. Whenever you use your credit card, you're assuming that your future is going to be shaped in a certain way. That's what Lazzarato, his work on the debt society, is pointing to. So we all live in debt. So we have all already imagined too much of our future, so to speak. So I think for me the problem is not that we cannot imagine the future, but rather to live in the present. And I do think that here again, I'm a Spinozist. I don't think that there's a separation between ideas and practice. I don't think there's a separation between the artist doing a work and then the activist going and carrying the ideas into practice. I do think that art and even philosophy is a practice. I do think that changing the way in which people think, that's what philosophers aspire to do, or changing the way in which people feel, or in which people relate to one another, is as much as a practice and possibly also a political act as in marching in the streets, which, by the way, is not necessarily the most politically effective form for doing politics today. So I do think that this binary also between the artist and the activist, the theorist and the theory and the practice has to be rethought, particularly because we live in times where those boundaries are by themselves collapsing. They're by themselves being shaken. So, I mean, that's at least my perspective. I'll just give you an example. Like, the most important thing that happened, I've lived now in New York 10 years, the most important thing that happened was Occupy Wall Street, politically speaking. I mean, what was Occupy Wall Street? I mean, it was people occupying a square, which was already a symbol of Wall Street, so it was a symbolic occupation of a symbol that was a symbol. Like, it was like Plato's nightmare, like 5 times away from reality. But in a way, it was very effective. And if somebody like, if the word socialism is no longer, at least in New York City, something that people, and when they hear this word, they completely freak out. It's because Occupy Wall Street has indeed brought to the awareness of people who are not aware of it, that there's the 99% and there's the 1%. Forget that we got Trump afterwards for a moment. But I think of this movement as a movement that go in a caustic way. So they operate underneath and then they erupt and there are interruptions, but that work is not gone. So I do think that Occupy Wall Street as a phenomenon blurred the line between artistic practices and activism. And I mean, I hope there will be more of that.
I'm wondering, the logical question, if you could start your expose just with Imaginal, without looking at traditional history of imagination and thesis. And then I have a comment. I cannot actually connect or identify Idebor as situations with imagination, because it was more in situations and other kinds of practices. Also, like, I think the end of his life actually told a little bit who was he publicly and who was he personally, and all this need of Idebor was born, like, and it's still continued. I don't know why, but it's kind of stuff. And the third thing is when you said Imaginal, my first creative connection was with Germinal, Emile Zola novel that was written in 1860s, and all novels written with imagination. But what he did, he wrote a novel on the real life of the miners in France. So the next process in this would be like, okay, is Imaginal about realism? What about fiction? What about... I think it's important to take some position because you are talking in interesting ways, you know, but still, I don't see any position, okay, as a philosopher or someone who is kind of proposing another thinking, based on another thinking something, let's say. And yeah, if it's imaginable, how we operate with it.
Mm.
If you take philosophy as practice, as you said, then there are some.
Yeah, okay, let me begin with the first question. I think I could have begun just with Imaginal, and I mean, I did at times, but I tend to see that if you don't give the genealogical context, then people are confused as to why is this philosophy.
Why this is?
But why this is the case? Because the language that we use, we tend to think that perhaps because we have this fantasy that we are individual and possess of ourselves, we don't realize that whenever we use a certain language, there's so many historical presuppositions that we bring with it. Like, as a matter of fact, when Aristotle said imagination, he was not bringing in certain presuppositions. When Dante said imaginatio in Latin, he was not bringing in certain philosophical presuppositions. When we say this is the fruit of your imagination, we mean whether we know it or not, and most of the time we don't know, most of the time we're not aware of the historical layers of our thinking. We're not aware of all the ontological implications that are rooted in the history of the concept. But every language is a universe that is rooted in its history. So in this sense, I do believe we are historical beings, and that's the reason why I could have given a presentation without that brief genealogical context, but I don't think that you would have been persuaded that the imaginal is an important term unless one gives a little bit of this context. And I was brief here. I mean, I think that if my aim would have been to sell the imaginal, I could have given like just the first 2 chapters of the book, which are all historical, and then at the end of the 2 chapters, one is, I mean, what usually happens is that some people who read that work, they stick with Castoriadis, also because he's a man and is more established as a figure, philosophically speaking, but particularly today. But whereas for some reason most of the theories of Imaginal are women, I don't know why. And women, particularly in the US in philosophy, they don't do very well. Like for 10 philosophy professors, 2 are women, 8 are men. So women are really a minority. But the concept of the imaginal, I mean, all those who have really worked on all the 3 concepts, I mean, everybody tends to agree that it's a concept that helps to clarify what is at stake when we conceptualize our capacity to imagine, and to go beyond what has become a kind of a past. So whenever there's I mean, I can tell, because I get invited to every conferences on imagination. I am perceived as the philosopher of the imagination, at least in the Western context. So I get invited to all of them, and it's always the same contest between philosophy of imagination versus philosophy of the social imaginary. I mean, you can call it Kant versus Lacan, or if it's not Kant and Lacan, it's going to be other 2 Western philosophers, usually men. But it's always the same opposition between the 2 fields. And I do think that it's a false opposition in the end. You know? Whether you take it from the perspective of the individual as a single unity or the imaginary as a single social context is always the same ontology that lies behind those. So I do think that the historical part is necessary in order to understand why the concept is useful. I also think that the situations are imaginal beings. So for me, the imaginal is simply what is made of images. It doesn't mean that images are immaterial. I actually think of images
At the
as
same time, you have imagery as imaginal
Right.
things, that's something that is made of images. So
yes, but that's why
I'm asking you this, I'm interested in
Yeah.
how do
Yeah, no.
understanding these things.
Yeah, but that's exactly why I don't use the notion of imagery either, because when you say imagery, there's also the implicit assumption is that it's just about images that are not as a representations, okay? Whereas the way I define the notion of the imaginal is as representations that are also presences in themselves. So more as presences than representations. And in this sense, I'm particularly interested in architecture and the way in which buildings themselves carry a capacity to imagine. We were talking before about the way in which buildings think, buildings imagine. I mean, the inbuilt space can exercise this capacity. And finally, I'm taking too much time. I do think the German is a good example because it's clearly realist fiction. I do think that the concept of imaginal precisely enables us to suspend the question. So, is it realism or is it fiction? An imaginal perspective would immediately tell realism is as much as fiction as surrealism. It's just a different form of fiction. So the reality effect is a literary device, is an imaginal device, as much as the surrealist effect. So in this sense, yes, the journal is imaginal, and no doubt.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you all the questions.